Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my first of two play-in overview and in-depth analysis of all of the teams that are going to be in the play-ins of Worlds 2022. I'm incredibly excited to make these videos. We've had our chance to talk about some of the teams that we've known about all year long, that I've been talking about quite a bit on this channel all year long, but now it is finally time for us to talk about some of the ones that we're not as familiar with. Some of the play-in teams, which I'm incredibly excited to do. Obviously, some very, very good teams in the play-ins, but also a chance to talk about some of the minor regions that really haven't gotten a lot of spotlight on this channel. If you guys are excited for this video, let me know down in the comment section below. Let me know who you think is going to be winning Group A, who you think is going to be surprising a lot of people in Group A, maybe over-exceeding expectations, under-exceeding expectations. Let me know all of that down below. I love hearing you guys' very varied opinions on all of these topics. But today is going to be about Group A in the play-ins. And Group A is definitely an interesting one. I personally think that Group A is a little bit, just a tad bit, weaker as a group. I think the top-end talent certainly isn't there, but I do think that the bottom is significantly more condensed. I could see this group going in a lot of different ways. So in this video, we're going to be going over all 6 teams that are in Group A. We're going to be going over their strengths, their weaknesses, where I personally power rank them out of all 24 teams at the tournament. And then at the end, we're going to be giving my predictions for the team that is going to be getting out in first place automatically, the team that's going to be getting second, and the teams that will be playing each other in a best of 5 and 3 and 4. And so a lot of fun stuff coming up. If you are excited, please let me know down in the comment section below. But I don't want to waste too much of your time. I don't want to waste too much of my time. Let's go ahead and jump right into our first team. And the first team, we're going to be doing this in order. So we're going to be doing it in the order that they were drawn in the group draw stage. And so we're going to be kicking it off with our Pool 1 seed that was drawn first for Group A, which of course was Fnatic, as they are the first team that was drawn into Group A. Of course, the Pool 1 seed from the LEC, their third seed coming out. They actually had an extra seed go to Worlds this year. We'll talk about them in Group B a little bit later, but Fnatic kind of headlining Group A here, I think is very good for their chances. Obviously, this is a team that at one point in the playoffs, or even before the playoffs, like at multiple points in the regular season, was looking like they weren't even close to being a top 4 team in Europe. They end up making a big playoff run. They beat Excel, they beat Misfits, they beat Mad Lions to make their way to the 3rd seed. They weren't able to do it against eventual champions Rogue, but honestly, I'm not too worried about that, especially in hindsight. Rogue, in my opinion, very clearly the number 2 team out of the LEC. Maybe the number 1 team, obviously. Maybe they can surprise me at Worlds this year, but that's more up for debate in the other comment sections when I was going over those teams, both Rogue and G2. So if you want to get mad, go listen to my opinions on those videos. But we're talking about Fnatic here today. I have Fnatic personally power ranked at 12. I think that's a relatively reasonable ranking. They come in 1 spot below Rogue, 2 spots below Cloud9. I feel like that's about where they are. They're right above some of the other teams that I've power ranked in the main stage. Teams like 100 Thieves, teams like GAM. They're right above that tier, in my opinion. And I think they've pretty much proven that. They're a very talented team. It's just about getting the momentum to roll in their favor. We've known what this team has been all year long, which is incredibly volatile. Obviously, the talent has been there. I predicted them to win the LEC both at the beginning of spring and at the beginning of summer, because it was really hard for me to quit on the amount of talent that this team had. If they got it together, they were going to be one of the best teams in the West. And unfortunately, it never felt like it really clicked in the way that people wanted it to. It certainly got better towards the back half of the year. They ended up going 3-0 in the final week of the LEC in order to qualify for playoffs. And then they go on that big playoff run to even get here to the World Championships in the first place. I think it really just shows that Fnatic is a much more momentum-based team, and they can definitely get into a little bit of a rut if they're being exploited for some of their weaknesses. But their strengths are incredibly strong. They still are the team that everybody thought they might be going into the year. You still have Wonder, Razor, Cumin, and Epson Hillisang. There is arguably not a more there's one more talented, but there's only one other team, I would say, in play-ins that is more talented than Fnatic, being RNG, and that's really not a fair comparison. And so for Fnatic to sit here and be favorites, I would say be the first team pooled in Group A, I think was definitely a good showing, a lucky draw for them, because they don't really have to face any of the other major competition. But what does this team do well? What does it not do well? Well, Obviously, the talent, like I said, is absolutely ginormous. A lot of that is exemplified, in my opinion, in the bot lane. In my opinion, Upset has been this team's best player. I think for a majority of the year, you can talk about the consistency with him. He really hasn't been able to take over games as consistently as I think a lot of people have wanted him to, but I think a lot of that has mostly been that he's just not really been put in positions for him to be able to capitalize in the way that he would want to. Hylissang has certainly been up and down throughout the year. Upset certainly hasn't had the most consistent of laning partners. There are games where Hilly is still Hilly, where he can play really aggressive. I've really liked him on picks like the Renata, even picks like the Braum that we've seen come out of this Fnatic team. I've actually really enjoyed picks like that. I think it's really played to their strengths, and I would like to see more of that at Worlds, but it's going to be a little bit difficult when you play that aggressive in a meta where you're going to be picking things like the Lulu. You're going to be ideally picking things like the Yuumi. Like, it's just not really the meta that Hylissang was made for, and we've kind of been seeing that throughout the year, where Upset can generate a little bit of a lead in the 2v2 in the early game, but Hylissang just gives over so much pressure by playing too aggro when he doesn't really have the map state to do so, and so overall, you hope that those two can kind of settle it down a bit. Mostly Hylissang again. Like I said, I think Upset has been almost criminally underrated at this point by most of the League fan base. I think he's a very good AD carry, one of the best in the West without a question in my mind. And obviously, the meta is definitely shifting more towards, or at least what a lot of people say to be a jungle-focused meta, or at least that's what I'm entailing. A lot of people are saying it's going to be a more top-focused meta. I'm certainly not sold on that yet, so we'll see. If Upset still gets to play some of these late-game carries, things like the Aphelios, things like even the Sivir Zeri, I know obviously they've been nerfed, but we'll see how much they're actually nerfed. The team spent the entire year practicing with them. I would be shocked if some teams didn't still pull them out at Worlds, but if we get more Aphelios, if we get more things like that, I think Upset could do really well on that. And if we move towards a more early game focused bot lane, like some people are expecting, the Caitlyn, the Misfortune, things like that, I think Upset is just as poised to be able to do well in a meta like that as well. So Upset, I think, is a big part of this team. And obviously, as we saw through their playoff run, Razork is an absolutely ginormous part of this team. When he was on, he was the best player in the playoffs. Basically, no question. He carried Fnatic through their first 3 series. It wasn't just him, obviously, but for you to get MVP in all 3 series that this team won back to back in the playoffs is an absolutely huge moniker for him to hold going into Worlds. If he can have that form going into Worlds on things like the Trundle, things like the Poppy, obviously Poppy a little bit different now, but the Wukong is still going to be viable. We might even see something like the Hecarim come out. If those things are going to be viable and you want to be able to make that early impact, Razork is going to need that form that he showed in playoffs because he was able to out-jungle quite a few good junglers. I mean, say what you want about Excel, but Marcoon is certainly a good jungler, and especially to come back from down 2-0 in those playoffs is absolutely huge. He out-jungled Elyoya in their series, who we'll talk about later in this video. Honestly, Razork was just really consistent and really good overall. And then you've got Humanoid in the mid lane. Ups and downs for Humanoid, certainly ups and downs. Humanoid has had a very interesting split because it really has felt very binary for him in the sense of, did he die before 4 minutes? If yes, he's going to lose lane and his team's going to be in a bad spot. If no, he's going to win lane and his team's going to be in a good spot. It really is that crazy for Humanoid that if he can just play more consistently in the early game, I really think that he's going to be in a really good spot to be able to do a lot of damage. His laning stats really aren't all that bad. It's just the significant amount of pressure that he gives over in the early game by being significantly too far forward without really any backup. It's going to be a lot on Razork to be able to keep him safe. He did a great job of that in the playoffs. Obviously, teams were trying to target Humanoid in the early game. Razork was able to identify that and be able to ward off pressure. But obviously, it's still up to Humanoid to not die in those situations, to not put himself in a situation where he is going to be a free gank at 3 minutes, or he's going to have to blow his flash immediately. It can lose him games. It can actually lose this team games. And so a lot of it's on Humanoid, a lot of it's on Razork. Definitely a little bit concerned. These are probably the areas of the team that I'm most concerned about. While I am concerned about Hylissang, he has been relatively consistent on the international stage over the past few years. Razork, a player who's never made a world championship. Humanoid, a player coming off of a pretty good world championship, but really has a lot of showing to do on this specific Fnatic team. Those are the players that I think really need to step up in order for this team to be where it wants to be. And then you've got Wunder in the top lane. I know a lot of people talk about how Wunder is very feast or famine. I don't really see him that way. He can certainly lose lane, but for a top laner, I honestly think he's relatively consistent. He's a phenomenal team fighter, especially on his picks, whether it's the Ornn, whether it's the Gragas. Obviously, those are the things he's going to be most well known for in that top lane, but pulled out the Gwen a ton. If they wanted to aggress in the top lane, he certainly was someone who could take advantage of that. Hell, even on the Gragas, we saw multiple full AP builds coming out from him. If there is some sort of quote-unquote top-focused meta going into Worlds, I think Fnatic is one of the teams in the plans that I think is most well-prepared to be able to capitalize on it. But I really, I'll talk about this more in my meta analysis. I see it going a little bit more in the other direction. I think there are a lot of really good tanks right now, and we're going to find that tanks are going to be an incredibly strong part of Worlds. Maybe I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm wrong, but it just seems to be my condition of the analysis right now. So overall, I think Fnatic is a good team. I don't think that they're a great team. They're listed at 12 here. I have them in that same boat, like I said, as teams like Rogue, teams like 100 Thieves. This is a team that I think in the right circumstances might theoretically be able to make it out of group stage, like not play-ins, but actual group stage. So they should have a pretty easy time being able to get out of play-ins. They, in my opinion, are easily the best team in this group, in Group A. They should have a pretty easy time being able to secure that #1 seed and not even really have to play a best of 5 coming out of play-ins. And if that's the case, hopefully that gives them enough time to start gelling together to get an idea of the meta so they can move forward into group stage with a more confident attitude. They might have to play some of the best teams in the world in group stage, so you definitely need to see them build the confidence now. That's going to bring us to our second Pool 1 team here in Group A, and that is going to be our PCS 2 seed here coming in. It's going to be Beyond Gaming, and Beyond is a team that I'm certainly interested to talk about because they really fluctuate in my mind from being a decent team and a not decent team. They come in somewhere in the middle. They actually come in all the way down at number 22 in my power rankings. I don't see them as one of the better teams at Worlds this year. That should be pretty clear. 22 out of 24 isn't exactly the best ranking of all time, but they do have some positives, and they do come from a good region. Let's talk about how they got here, though, because this is a team that was not very good in the regular season. They were a team that, I believe, finished 6th in the regular season in the PCS, went on a big playoff run, was able to get into finals by beating PSG Talon, an absolutely huge win in a best of 5 for this team, but they got completely smacked in the finals, really weren't even on the same level as the Flying Oysters, which I already am a little bit lower on the Oysters than a lot of other people. Beyond coming in here, I just don't have a lot of faith they're actually like a dominantly good team. Mostly because, and I think a lot of that again comes down to their playstyle. I'll talk about this a bit, but their playstyle in the playoffs was certainly different than their playstyle in the regular season. In the regular season, I think they were really able to get by on being a really good early game laning team. They were able to lane a lot into the rest of the teams in the PCS, were able to generate leads in the 1v1 and the 2v2, and then transition that into more calculated oriented mid-game plays. But that certainly was not the case in the playoffs. They were quite often getting outplayed in the early game, and it was often up to players like Minji, players like Kino, to be able to turn the game around towards the back half of the game, and they did a great job of that. And Minji, I actually think, is a really, really solid player. He's probably the biggest reason why this team is at Worlds this year. He really has adapted to the meta overall, the Taliyah, the Sylas, the Ahri, his 3 most played champions of the split, the 3 best champions of the split. It's always good to see when a player can actively pick up meta champions, feel comfortable on them, and do well on them, and he was doing well on them, even when his team wasn't winning. I know the win rates aren't perfect for Minji in the mid lane, but that's mostly because this entire team wasn't really winning all that much in the regular season. I think he clearly, in my opinion, is the best player on this team. And then if you're going off of the playoff run, Kino was also a huge part of that playoff run, but that's a big question mark for me because you have Waco, you have Kino as your bot lane here for Beyond Gaming, and I'm really concerned with how these two are going to hold up against better competition at the next level. Waco and Kino are both fine players. Waco, I'm definitely still questionable on overall as a player, but Kino, I think, is a really good engaged support player, and I definitely think that that can be positive, but when you start going up against some of the better teams in the world, when you're going up against a team like Fnatic or a team like EG in this group, engaged supports are pretty easily counterable as long as you know what you're doing, and I'm not really sure Kino has the flexibility to move off of that. He really didn't play any enchanters at all this year. He played the Nami, but really only with the Lucian, and so I didn't really like the versatility that I was seeing out of this bot lane. And then, like I said, I thought Waco was actually a little bit underwhelming as a bot laner. A lot of the teams that are coming into Worlds this year, especially ones that started to snowball a bit during the playoffs, were because they had really good bot laners that were able to take advantage of the state that the meta was in. I don't think that's Beyond. I think you have Lakai and Husha in the top half of the map. You have your top laner, your jungler there. They're both fine, not dominant players. Lakai actually had a really good regular season, at least the stats say so. I wasn't able to watch every single game, but he was really underwhelming to me in the playoffs. I know a lot of people were hyping him up as a really good top laner. I certainly didn't see it in my, admittedly limited PCS viewing experience. There's a chance that he comes out and surprises me and is really good. Same for Husha, but right now, from what I saw, I really wasn't all that impressed with them. So honestly, like, as a whole package experience, Beyond Gaming, I think, at best, is fine. At worst, is a team that I think might actually be able to be taken advantage of in the group stage. We'll get to my predictions later, but coming in at 22 is certainly not a ringing endorsement. I think overall, the PCS is significantly weaker this year. Pretty much none of the teams that I watched in the PCS felt world-beating. I mean, PSG Talon looked pretty good for most of that series, but they weren't able to beat Beyond, and I don't think Beyond is all that good of a team. So what are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What do they have to play to? Well, Minji really needs to win lane. Like, that's going to be a huge, huge factor for Beyond. I think Husha is going to have a lot of pressure to be able to play around that mid lane, and ideally you're going to be able to make plays across the map. Try to control objectives, try to control map pressure with your jungle mid duo if you can generate that lead, or at least that shove, that map advantage in the mid lane. If you're able to do that, I think you're going to be in a better spot, but without that, I don't really see a lot of avenues for this team to win. I imagine there's going to be a lot of coordinated plays around objectives, things like 3 or 4-man plays around Dragon with Kino roaming up on the Nautilus, on the Leona, things like that. Or you're going to be seeing a lot more play around topside. If we are going to be getting a top lane focus meta, I could see them wanting to invest in a player like Lakai, who does play more aggressive picks. He's not a tank player. He's a Gwen, Fiora, Gnar, like that kind of idea. I'm sure he plays as the Jace. I'm sure that if it comes out at Worlds, he's going to be happy to pick it up. And so I see it as one of those two. Those are basically your two strategies. Either get that shove in the mid lane, try to play for those 4v4s around Dragon and just control the tempo by rotating early and making sure that you're there first, or try to snowball top lane out of control. It really depends on what you think your best avenue is. I think Minji is this team's best player. I would happily play around him, and I would want to get Kino involved in a lot of these plays when he's playing on the aggressive. He's certainly better, but I can understand if you feel like you want to make sure that your more aggressive top laner is a little bit more sheltered on the world stage. It really is up to what this team wants to do. Either way, I really don't think they're all that certain to be able to generate leads. A lot of this is predicated on the fact that Minji needs to win in the mid lane, and I think against players in this group, like Humanoid, like Jojo Pune, I think that's a very difficult proposition for me to imagine, even if I do like the way he plays. And so overall, while Beyond is a pool 1 seed, my expectations are incredibly, incredibly low for this team, at least in comparison to the other 3 pool 1 seeds here at Worlds. Is there a chance that they can go out and upset a lot of people and maybe even pull off a really surprise best of 5 win to get to that, 2-3 matchup? Maybe. I certainly think it's possible, but it's, I'm not sure it's something I'm even counting on at all. So it'll be interesting to see how this team performs, but my expectations are, I think, lower than a majority of people for Beyond. Moving on to our Pool 2 teams now here in Group A. We've got 2 of each Pool, 1, 2, and 3. We covered the 2 Pool 1 teams. It's time to cover the Pool 2 teams. Kicking it off with the first team drawn here to Group A, the number 1 seed out of the LJL from Japan, Detonation FocusMe, DFM, a team that has been to Worlds over and over again, a team that actually made it out of play-ins last year, made it to the group stage, wasn't really able to do anything on that group stage, was slotted into an incredibly difficult group, but still, I mean, this is a team that actually made it out of play-ins last year, so they should not be taken for granted. This was a very, very dominant team. They were clearly, again, the most dominant team in the LJL. Sengoku actually gave them a little bit of a run for their money in summer regular season, but by the time playoffs rolled around, it really was not even close. DFM was so clearly the best team coming out of the LJL, and, it really has been that. Over the course of the years, it's the same team, DFM, at Worlds for the LJL every year, and a lot of these players are going to be recognizable because of that. Players like Evie, players like Steel, players like Utapon have all been here before. They were all here last year on this team. However, those aren't really the players that this team loves to play around. They actually, very much according to meta, at least for most of this year, really like to play around bot lane. They like to play around Utapon, yes, but Harp, Yaharong, very much a big focus piece of what DFM wants to do. And that is not the only reason, but one of the reasons why they come in for me at number 21 in my power rankings. A little bit above Beyond, but still not like a dominant team here in play-ins. Just kind of they're a good team, but I'm definitely worried about their transition to this meta. I think they have a lot of talent on here. I do really, really like what I've seen out of this bot lane. Utapon and Harp, I think, are a really, really good duo. They have very much adapted to what the meta has been throughout the year, which is Zeri, Sivir, and then Enchanters, right? And I think that's been a huge plus. Anytime I see that from a team, it shows me that they're at least willing to be able to pull that out at a big stage like Worlds, and I think if you're more comfortable pulling that out at Worlds, you're probably going to do better. That's just simply what I think right now. I think if you can play the Lulu, if you can play the Yuumi with, you know, this hyper carry bot lane right now at Worlds, I'm going to feel pretty confident because I think a lot of teams are going to immediately default to that kind of play style. And if you can do it better than a lot of the other teams, I feel pretty confident about that. Utapon and Harp have definitely been the focal point of DFM. They're the highest by far in their region with KP percentage as a bot lane. And so overall, definitely something that they do like to play around. They very much want to make sure that Utapon can get ahead and be able to carry towards the back half of the game. And then you've got Yaharong in the mid lane, who I actually thought was pretty good this year. I really liked what I saw from him on tape. Obviously, big shoes to fill here, with Arya obviously going to KT Rolster. And he really stepped up. He was much more of a carry presence than I expected him to be. I thought the team was going to play around their more familiar members, especially topside, a bit more, but they really like to invest resources into this mid lane. Really great win rates on Ahri, Azir, Talia. Pretty much everything they picked up over the course of the season worked. And I do think that Yaharong feels more in tune with somebody that would be good at Worlds than maybe someone like a Tally, who we will talk about later. Not that Tally isn't good, but just someone who I think is a little bit more prepped for what we might see at Worlds. He can play the carries, he can play the supportive picks. He's really versatile, and I think that's a huge plus for DFM as a whole. And so overall, I think those three are definitely the power points of the team, and you wouldn't expect that if you were a longtime fan here, because Evie and Steel have been on this team. They've been able to perform on the world stage before. Evie especially has been someone who's been a carry force for DFM at Worlds before, and it just is very weird for me to come out and say that he was such a low value piece for DFM in the playoffs this year. Obviously, I can't speak for what he was over the course of the entire season, but this team did not want to play around topside. I'm not sure if that was just a matchup thing for some of the teams they were going into, but this team very much did not want to play up there. And Steel was actually kind of a secondary piece for this team as well. Usually, especially in this meta, junglers are a focal point, something that you really want to play completely around. Steel was not that for DFM here. He was very low in pressure, very low in resources. A lot of the work that he was doing was giving resources to other members of the team, much more of a supportive style. Evie, in a very similar boat, played a ton of tanks throughout the playoffs, and I would expect, honestly, that to continue at Worlds, especially if we go to that tank meta that I would expect. If we are getting that, I think DFM is actually in a really good spot to be able to adjust to what the meta is going to be. If you do want to play around a more aggressive early game bot lane like the Caitlyn, like the MF, or if you just want to scale, get your hyper carry online like the Aphelios, or the Jinx for that matter, I think that Utapon is going to be really good at both. This team really likes to invest resources into that bottom lane. Harp has already shown that he is masterful on a lot of the enchanters that we're going to be seeing at Worlds. I expect that to continue. Yaharong is an incredibly versatile mid laner. And then Evie and Steel don't have to be super heavy resource players in order to be incredibly effective on the map. Evie especially very good on tanks, very low resource over the course of the playoffs. Steel basically only played Wukong as far as I was aware throughout the playoffs. That's going to be fine. If you want to play Wukong all throughout Worlds, go play Wukong. If it gets banned, I'm sure he can play the Trundle. I'm sure he can play the Hecarim. I'm really not all that concerned with Steel's champion pool. We know he can play champions. And so, overall, I'm actually a little bit higher, I think, on DFM than some of the other people. I know a lot of people are talking about them as like a mid-tier, like a med-tier team coming out of the LJL here. Like, definitely not as good as last year. And while I agree with that, I certainly don't think this team is as talented as they were last year, and I'm not sure the meta fits them nearly as well. I still do think that they can make an impact on the world stage. If this was a team that ended up finishing third in the group, I really wouldn't be all that surprised. Now, top two, probably a little bit ambitious for DFM here. Winning a best of 5, definitely ambitious, especially when you're almost certainly going to have to play another major region in that BO5 to even make it out of groups. And so, overall, I think DFM could shock quite a few teams here, including some of the top teams in this group, but I do think there's a little bit of a ceiling just on merit of their talent level. If they can break through that, I'd love it. If Utapon, Harp, Yaharong can really step up, hell, someone like Evie can really step up and be that carry force that pushes them over the edge, that would be great. It's just not something I'm particularly expecting. I think they're going to be a good team at Worlds, maybe not a great team. Moving on to our fourth team here in Group A, the fourth team drawn to Group A, and it is our number 3 seed out of the LCS here in North America. We have Evil Geniuses. The final team coming out from NA at Worlds here. Definitely a team that I'm happy to see on the World stage. Obviously a big initiative into endemic North American talent over the course of the year. Definitely some things we got to talk about in terms of roster turmoil for this team. Talked about it obviously a bit, and if you've been following the LCS, you already know what I'm going to say, but we'll get into that when we start talking about the roster. They come in for me at number 14 in my power rankings, which some people might find to be a little bit high, but I actually really like the upside of this team, even without Danny at AD carry. I think with Danny not playing, obviously it lowers the ceiling a bit of what this team might be able to accomplish. But I honestly might have had them higher than this if they did have Danny. I think this is a pretty decent spot for EG, even with Kaori in at AD carry. Obviously, hope Danny gets better. Nothing but well wishes to him. Don't want to add to any of the flame here by saying like, oh, he should be at Worlds. It's his life. He's freaking 19 years old, 18, 19 years old. Let him get his head on straight. He can come back next year stronger than ever. He will be here again. I can promise you that. So I'm not all that worried about Danny. You know, I just only well wishes sent to him. Nothing at no flame, obviously. But this team's ceiling is definitely a little bit lower, I would say, without him here on the team for Worlds. And I think a lot of that is just because of how much this team really relied on him in the late game. Obviously, you have a ton of really good early game impact players. Inspired in the jungle is one of the better early game junglers in the West. He really knows how to be able to generate leads, not only for himself, but very consistently for his team. Mostly, it's been the bottom lane. He's been able to make sure that they've been able to get online. It's going to be interesting to see if they adapt that strategy a bit now that they have no Danny, but Vulcan is obviously really, really good at that as well. Able to play the Enchanters, able to play the Engagers, was really good on both. Really good as that secondary supportive piece. Really like how Vulcan played this year, in my opinion. The best support coming out of North America. And then you have JoJo, who's just a laning monster. If he's able to get that 1v1 lane off, I really don't think there's anybody in this group that's even remotely on his level in terms of just pure 1v1 laning. I think Humanoid theoretically could be, but he certainly hasn't been over the course of the year. He's a good laner, but JoJo is a great laner. JoJo's big problems are actually very similar to Humanoid. The fact that he can relatively easily get caught out in the early game, and he's not great at transitioning that lead into something like super game takeover worthy in the late game, but if you're looking for a positive from JoJo, it's for sure the laning impact that he has on the game. Impact, on the other hand, I've been saying his name accidentally all throughout this video already, but Impact in the top lane, not someone who necessarily plays for lane. Can play for lane if they want to invest into the top lane. He's certainly someone who can do that, but hasn't really been all that successful at doing it this year. Obviously, the Gangplank has been absolutely ginormous for EG over the course of the year. I would expect most teams to just straight ban that out. He hasn't been nearly as consequential on many other picks over the course of the split. In fact, I think Impact has had a little bit of a down split. What I said on my channel was one of the worst ones he's had in quite a while. And I think a lot of that is just because he's been forced to play picks that he's not all that comfortable on. The Aatrox, the Sejuani, just things that I don't think really are all that are all his style. I think Ornn, something like that, could be really, really positive for this EG team. Obviously, if you get more of the Gangplank, pick more of the Gangplank. It's very much worked. You got the first pentakill on a top laner in the LCS, so just go do it. Just go do it. Go pick Gangplank if it's there, but if it's not, I would expect this team to go do more of a tank style. So where does that leave them? Well, it leaves Inspired with a huge responsibility to be able to generate those early game leads, and oftentimes I think those leads are going to come at the expense of bot lane. They're going to be coming for Inspired and probably for JoJo. I expect a lot of attention to be pumped into this mid lane. If they want to go the more aggressive picks, I do think they're a little bit more viable at Worlds than maybe they've been in the past, but if they want to go the more supportive picks, if you want to put JoJo on the Sylas, on the Taliyah, on the Ahri, I do think that it's certainly possible for them to just get so far ahead as a jungle mid duo that they can then invest a ton into bot side. Very similar to what I was talking about for Beyond Gaming, where I don't think their bot laner is like super duper great. In this case, I think Kaori is certainly good enough, but he's not the focal point of the team. When you have a really good jungle mid support trio, you can generate a lot of those leads around the bot laner, and all he has to do is not mess it up. And Kaori is certainly a good enough player to not mess it up. I think that could be a pretty vital and integral strategy for EG going into this World Championships, but Everything they do, absolutely everything they do is going to revolve around Inspired. He was the MVP of the league for a reason. He's going to have to be able to keep it up. If he can't, I don't really see a world in which this team can expect to be better than a team like Fnatic. I definitely think there is a world if Inspired can step up, if JoJo can really prove that he is one of the best laning mid laners in the world, if Vulcan can prove why he's one of the best supports in the West. I think that there genuinely is a world in which this team very easily coasts to number 1 in Group A, just gets out very easily. I'm not going to say that that is super duper likely. Obviously, we'll get to predictions at the end here, but if you've seen the power rankings, you already kind of know where I'm going with this. I do think this team definitely has some flaws that it needs to overcome, but they should theoretically be able to beat pretty much anybody on the other side in a best of 5. Now, there's obviously a really interesting proposition here that we could potentially be getting EG versus Mad Lions in a best of 5. We'll talk about that a bit at the end of the episode, but certainly something that I would be a little bit cautious of if I was EG. Getting first seed, getting first place in Group A is going to be an incredibly important accomplishment because whoever comes out of that other side as the number 3 team to play in a best of 5 is going to be a team that you don't necessarily want to gamble your group stage fate against. So while EG is a good team, I think they really need to step up in order to get to that number 1 seed where they're going to feel a lot more confident going into the best of 5s. Moving on to our 5th team here in Group A, we have our representatives from Brazil, from the CBLOL, the winners of the CBLOL, Loud, and me included, not a lot of people expected to see this team at Worlds this year. Not that they're bad by any stretch of the imagination, but they didn't look all that dominant in the beginning part of the playoffs, even, especially in the regular season. There was a lot of doubt as to whether this team was like a top-tier team in the CBLOL because very new organization. They really invested a lot into kind of known players. Obviously, we know about Tinones. He's been around absolutely forever. A lot of people will remember him from the Kaboom era in 2014 where they beat Alliance. You've got players like Croc who have really been around the block, have been in the LPL, have been in OS, have really, been in a lot of regions, been able to play competitively for a long time. Even players like Robo and Brance have certainly been playable, for quite a while, have been on teams that have been, good. Seos as well. And by the way, if I say if I pronounce any of the CBLOL names wrong, I really do apologize. As far as I'm aware, there's no English cast of CBLOL, and so I watch it without sound because unfortunately I don't speak Portuguese, and presumably that's what they're speaking in Brazil. And so unfortunately, if I pronounce any of these names wrong, I really, really do apologize. Trying my best, but for Loud, what do I think their strengths and weaknesses are? Well, unfortunately, I really don't think they're all that good of a team coming to Worlds this year. I have them power ranked 23rd, so not last. Definitely not last, but, second from last isn't ideal. I do think they have power players, if that makes any sense. I think Brance, their AD carry, I think, is a power player. I think they've really learned to be able to play around him in an AD carry-centric meta, and they've really been able to capitalize on a lot of the advantages that he generates basically by himself in laning phase. Him and Seos have an incredibly strong laning phase. Whether or not that's going to be consistent on the world stage, I definitely have my doubts over, but their 2v2 has been very, very good. And a lot of that, I think, is definitely expedited by the fact that this team is just generally able to win early game. Croc is generally able to generate pretty big leads against everybody he plays against. Tinones is generally able to generate pretty strong leads against anybody he plays against. I'm just not super confident that they have the mechanical talent to be able to pull that off in the same way that I feel confident that a team like EG is going to be able to pull that off in play-in stage. I think Loud going up against Fnatic, going up against EG in these consistent games, I'm very worried about their ability to consistently be able to win in the early game. And then that really raises a lot of questions for the rest of this team because the team doesn't really have a backup plan. And we saw that in playoffs anyways, where they would often be able to generate a lot of leads, especially around the bottom lane, be able to get dragons, control objectives, control the bottom side of the map, and be able to snowball it out of control from there. But when they didn't, they weren't able to win. They lost winners finals. They had to win through losers bracket, and then obviously swept the finals, swept PNG in the finals anyways. But Loud was still, they weren't one of these teams that was like, if they didn't win in the early game, they had a backup plan. They were able to generate lead. They were able to keep their cool. They were really an early game focused team. And while I think that can definitely be a positive, a team that is very aggressive and wants to play around the early game, that can generate leads, I think that can be good. But you really have to hope and pray that your players can hold up in the 1v1 and the 2v2, or that you have this big macro advantage, which it really hasn't felt like Loud has had all year long at Worlds. And I'm just not super sold that this team is going to be able to have either of those things. While I do think that Tinones is an incredibly strong mid laner, a lot of his leads have generally just been him being better on matchups that aren't particularly favorable. Like, he plays the Talia, the Ahri, the Sylas. I have praised a lot of players in the past for going to that, in this video even, and I'm gonna praise Tinones for that because I think it can be good, but the way that they don't really play, the way that they play around mid lane is not the way that a lot of teams play around the Talia or play around the Ahri. They don't really like to group and then move bot lane. They like to have Tinones just win early to be able to get shoved, to be able to get plates, and to be able to get gold so that when he does rotate to plays, they're going to generally fight all the time. Croc, in a similar vein, very early game focused power farming jungler, really wants to be able to pick up that Wukong, to pick up that Viego, and to be able to fight people early, to be able to generate those leads on his own. I'm definitely worried about what happens if they go against a team that has a coordinated level 1. What do they do from behind at that point? I get a little bit concerned about that, especially for Croc. The players, like I said, that I'm least concerned about are going to be Branson Seos in the bot lane here, because I do think that they have shown that they are a very, very good laning duo, and they've shown that they're willing to play for the early game as well. We saw a lot of Kalista out of Branson in the playoffs. If that's going to continue, I think that's going to be relatively positive for Loud. Maybe not the Kalista in general, but things like the Caitlyn, things like the Misfortune. If they want to pull out those early game focused AD carries, I do think that that is an area that they can pretty continuously pump up. But it's going to be a lot on the other players on the team to be able to make sure that they're attracting resources or at least able to assist in order to make sure that this bot lane isn't constantly targeted by enemy jungle. Because that's what I would do if I was playing Loud. I would simply just camp bot. Because I would force someone like Robo, I'd force someone like Tinones to be able to be the focal carry of the team, because they didn't really do that at all in the playoffs. Robo is mostly a tank player, a lot, and I mean a lot of Gnar. Olaf as well, very similar to Whippo in that respect. A lot of Olaf coming out. Certainly don't think we'll be seeing that at Worlds. I don't think that's going to be all that viable, but if he pulls it out, who knows? And then, like I said, Croc really needs to generate those early leads. I think that's going to be Loud's ticket to winning. So where does this team end up landing overall for me? Well, I don't really have a ton of confidence in them. I do think that they are capable of generating leads, but they are a very one-dimensional playstyle, and I think teams like that can more easily be taken advantage of on the international stage. I think they can compete with other teams in this group, teams like Detonation FocusMe, teams like Chiefs, who we're about to get to, a team like Beyond, I certainly think that they can beat, but are they going to be able to beat any of those teams consistently? Am I going to be betting on them to be able to beat any of those teams? I'm really not so sure. I think for me, they come in as the worst team in Group A, coming in at number 23, the second worst team at Worlds this year. There is a bit of leeway for them to prove me wrong, but it's mostly going to have to come through, in my opinion, this bot lane, because I just don't see anywhere else on the map really being this dominant carry threat. Maybe Tinones, but it's going to be on champions that he hasn't really been playing all split long, and so we'll end up seeing with Loud, but I'm certainly not going in with the highest of confidence for this Loud team overall. Moving on to our sixth and final team here in Group A, the final team to be drawn here into Group A at Worlds, and it is actually one of the teams I'm most excited to talk about in this group. It is the winners of the LCO and historic OS franchise, Chiefs Esports Club. Not only are they finally making their return to the international stage after many, many years, they were the dominant OS power for many years. A lot of people forget that, but they're doing it with probably the most dominant roster that region has ever seen. Not only did they go 21-0 in the regular season, they only dropped one game in playoffs, and it was in the finals. It was absolutely absurd. An absolutely absurd split for Chiefs, and it gives me a lot of confidence about this team going into the World Championships. We always talk about OS as being kind of like they're a good region, but they're not a great region. This is a team that this is a region I think that has perennially surprised a lot of people on the international stage, whether it was Pentanet at MSI a couple of years ago, whether it was Pentanet at Worlds last year. I think a lot of people were really surprised with how good this region ended up being at a lot of the international tournaments. And when you have a team that was this dominant in a region that has performed at least kind of okay in the past, that is something to take note of. Now, how do they play? What do they do? Well, it's really, really hard, honestly, to get a grip as to what this team's playstyle is, because in the LCO, they were just winning all the time. They never really had to do anything other than snowball the game out of control, because the early games were so consistently good, which is why, for me, they come in maybe a little bit lower than some people might want them to be. They do come in for me at number 20. I do think that they are a good team, but I'm really concerned about what this team is going to do playing from behind, because inevitably at this tournament, they're going to have to start playing from behind. And I just don't think they've really had to do that at all this year. At least they didn't have to do that at any time when I was watching. The game that they lost in the finals was fine. They were, they were in a decent spot. They just weren't able to capitalize. And those games happen. Even the best teams in the world have games like that. But for that to be your, weakest game on your resume, that is absolutely absurd. And so where does the strengths lie for this team? Where do the strengths, I should say, lie for this team? Well, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised when they hear that I think the best player on this team, basically without a doubt from what I've seen, has been Aladoric at the support position. He was phenomenal over the course of this year. I think he is one of the most interesting supports in the world right now in terms of, I would be stunned if some major region team doesn't snatch him up for next year. Obviously, NA is the obvious place because OS is no import, but he deserves to be playing in a top 4 league. He absolutely played his way into that this year. He was legitimately dominant on everything he played. Whether it was engagers, whether it was tank engagers like Nautilus, whether it was more speed engagers like Rakan, whether it was enchanters like Yuumi, Lulu, it didn't matter. He played everything to an absolutely high level, and he is, in my opinion, the best player that the LCO has. Period, end of story. I don't even think it's all that close. He was phenomenal, and he really helped Raze out a lot. And Raze, if people who follow this channel may know, I actually think pretty highly of Raze. Not ridiculously highly, but I think he's a pretty good player. And I thought he was a little bit underrated on Immortals last year. He comes back over to Chiefs, comes back over to OS this split, and is ridiculously good. His damage percentage, his KP percentage, incredibly high. Obviously, Arthur and Tally wanted to play around the spot lane. I think a lot of that was due to Aladoric and the amount that he could create for the spot lane, but Raze certainly followed up on it well. You can see a lot of the champions he ended up playing: Zeri, Aphelios, Kai'Sa, more of these late game focused hyper carry champions, because in the early game he really didn't need to have all that much pressure. He was able to get a lot of pressure from the top side, whether it was Tapoon creating that advantage or Arthur just being a general major nuisance on the map, which we'll get to, or if it was Aladoric really just controlling the laning tempo. Overall, Raze didn't really need to make all these crazy plays, and so while he is a good player and definitely someone that I think is positive for the team overall, it's going to be interesting to see if the meta does go to more early game focused ADCs, if Raze is going to be able to adapt to that, because pulling out the Aphelios, pulling out the Kai'Sa for most of this year, it's not like those two were the most meta champions of all time, especially the Kai'Sa. We really weren't seeing much of anywhere else, and so it'll be interesting to see if he just goes more to comfort here, or if he does invest a lot into the meta. It'll be interesting to see with that, but I think him and Aladoric in the bot lane, I'm really not all that concerned about. Aladoric is a phenomenal player. Arthur has also been great. Now, Arthur might be a familiar name to a lot of people, obviously. Formerly played in the LCK for Hanwha Life. Comes over here to OS, has been in OS for a little bit of time now, and has really, really dominated the region. He, in my opinion, was the pretty clear-cut MVP of the LCO from what I was able to watch throughout this year. He was phenomenal on these early game champions, on these champions that were really able to take over and snowball the game out of control. Wukong, Viego, Lee Sin even, these champions that are just so mechanically, if you get them right and if you're able to get your laners ahead, they can basically carry you to a lead. That's the amount of impact that these champions can have in the early game. Arthur played those really, really phenomenally. He's going to need to step up on those champions for this team to have the same kind of impact. Then you have Tally in the mid lane, and very similar to Raze, he had his own champion pool that I think he was very comfortable going to. Unlike Raze, I do think it was relatively good for the meta. I talked a lot about how I thought Swain was an incredibly underrated pick for a lot of teams around the world, especially a team like Team Liquid. I was shocked they weren't able to pull that out more. Tally was not afraid to pull out the Swain, to pull out the Lissandra, to pull out this thing that could really go incredibly even in laning phase, maybe not even get the shove, but just not lose and be able to, have the mobility to get to fights, and then in the late game could be more of this battle tank, this more engaged tank champion. On the Lissandra, obviously you can go in, stun everybody, and just ult yourself. On the Swain, you just stand there with ult on, and you basically heal tank everybody, you drain tank everybody in the game. Even played something like the Ahri if you wanted to be a little bit more of a playmaker. I really like the way that Tally adapted to this meta, and if they want to go for that more supportive style in the mid lane, if you have that super aggressive early game jungler, and then you have your support really making plays across the map, you can have Raze on a late game champion. I actually really like that synergy. Tapoon, also really good, especially in terms of laning. His laning stats were phenomenal. Wasn't really all that impactful in terms of the game outcome, mostly just because he was mostly on tanks, and the game was basically over by the time Tapoon was able to group up with his team. The perks of being a top laner. But again, Gnar, Sedge, Aatrox, I assume he plays Ornn as well. I expect Maokai, I imagine all that kind of stuff is going to be coming out for Chiefs at Worlds this year. So what are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Well, their strengths really are their commitment to dominating the early game, and their pure success at doing so. I know we talked about some other teams, a team like Loud, where I was really concerned about their ability to generate and consistently keep leads in the early game. I don't have that same kind of fear for a team like Chiefs because honestly, I trust their early game more. I have more faith in the talent of Chiefs than I do the talent of Loud. And so even though they play relatively similar games, I think Chiefs is probably going to translate a little bit better to the world stage. If they are able to generate those leads that they want, if they're able to get Arthur and Aladoric ahead, if you're able to get Raze in a position where he can carry in the late game, Tally in a position where he can be a huge nuisance, Tapoon's going to be a tank probably in the top lane, it's going to be incredibly difficult to actually crack this team overall. And so I actually have quite a lot of faith for Chiefs. We'll get into where I think with the predictions later, but if this was a team that was like scary in a best of 5 against one of the major region teams, I honestly wouldn't be all that surprised. It's certainly going to be an interesting run, and I really hope that this Chiefs team can live up to its domestic performance on an international stage as well. All right, that is going to do it for my Group A video here for play-ins. If you guys enjoyed, please go ahead and leave a like. It really does mean a lot for the channel. But up on the screen right now, you're going to see my Group A predictions. So let's go over where I think these teams are going to land, what kind of matchups you can expect maybe in some of the best of 5s, because it really is an interesting conversation to be had. A lot of really interesting things can happen between all of these teams. I really don't think they're all that different, but if I had to predict who's going to come in first right now, it's going to be Fnatic. I really think they're the most consistent, the highest ceiling team, and I think that should be able to carry them into that #1 spot as long as they play even remotely like they did in the playoffs. If Razork can really step up and be a good jungler, I should see this team having no trouble being able to claim that #1 spot, most specifically because Danny is no longer playing for EG at Worlds. That means that they fall for me to #2. I'm not saying that they would have been #1 with Danny. I'm saying it would have been a lot closer. Inspired versus Razork is certainly an interesting matchup, and I definitely think you could make the case for it to theoretically go either way, but for me, I am going to favor Fnatic in that matchup, so EG falls to #2 for me. Now, I talked about this in the video. Being #2 isn't quite what you want to be in this group. #1 auto-qualifies for the group stage. You don't have to play a single best of 5. You auto-qualify into the group stage. #2 has to play the winner of the 3 and 4 matchup from the other group, and that could actually be a really scary proposition. I'm not going to spoil my predictions, but it could be a team like Mad Lions. It could be a team like Saigon Buffalo. It could be a team like DRX that you have to play in a best of 5, and that's not really all that ideal in order to get into Worlds. And so, ideally, you want to finish #1, but for me, I have Fnatic at 1, I have EG at 2. They are clearly the 2 best teams in the group, in my opinion. You could see my 3-4 matchup, though, the teams that are going to be playing in the best of 5 against each other, to see who plays the 2 from the other group, is going to be Chiefs coming in at #3. Like I said, I have a decent amount of confidence that they're going to be able to translate their early game leads into beating some of the other minor region teams. I'm not quite sure about their success against Fnatic and EG in groups, but they should be able to handle DFM, Beyond, and Loud relatively consistently. And then I have DFM coming in here at #4, although that could be any of the other 2. That means I have Beyond and Loud as the 2 that are eliminated after the group stage here in play-ins. I could see this going quite a few ways, like I said, but Chiefs versus DFM I think would be the most interesting matchup, and I think they are the 2 best minor region teams in this group. Fnatic and EG, pretty clear-cut for #1 and 2 for me, and then Chiefs and DFM. Chiefs at 3 I think is a pretty strong vote of confidence for me, and then DFM at 4. I do think they have enough talent to be able to at least play one best of 5 before they're eliminated from groups. And then Beyond and Loud, unfortunately, I just don't think are going to be able to compete on the same level as those other 2 teams. A lot of people are going to predict Beyond just because they're in the PCS. There's a lot of fans of the CB LoL that I'm probably pissing off here by ranking Loud 6th. I just don't have a ton of confidence in either of these 2 teams to be able to play their game in the way that they were able to in their region. And so, obviously, anybody here can prove me wrong, and I'm kind of hoping they do because I want the most interesting play-ins possible. Upsets are always fun. If we see a team like Chiefs be able to get maybe #2 in the group, that would be awesome. I would love something like that, but it's just not something I'm willing to predict. But let me know how you guys feel about my predictions down in the comments section below. I know you guys are going to have different opinions for me, and I love chatting it up with you guys about them. So leave all those down there. Of course, while you're down there, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. This is only part 1 of my play-ins videos. Group B will be coming out tomorrow. It'll be a very similar video just about the Group B version of this play-ins group. So if you are excited for that, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you can be notified when that goes out. Obviously, we're still going to be doing a top 20 list for my top 20 players at Worlds. We're going to be doing a meta-analysis for the picks I expect to see a lot of, and then we'll be going through Worlds coverage every single day once the tournament starts on the 29th. If you guys are excited for that, I highly recommend you hit the subscribe button because we're going to have a ton of content that's going to be coming out over the course of the month. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.